let me welcome everybody to this pilot of what, for want of a better word, we're calling an ethical dragon's den. The idea of this is that a valiant guinea pig, I'm saying, or possibly not, I think, a valiant knight, is going to come and bring a description of some IT technology product that their company does. We're not here to validate it, to pass judgment on it. I mean, I've no doubt it's splendid because Rob Virchitz chairs it, but that's not really the point at issue. The point is to use it as a starting point for exploring some of the ethical issues that arise from this technology and the areas that it connects to. And to help us do this, we've got three distinguished commentators plus me, who are going to be as it were, the dragon. This is perhaps a little bit more like a moral maze than the dragon's den, but of course it has the advantage being interactive that participants, members of the company can contribute, and it's not just going to be listening to the five of us. But if I might just briefly introduce the dragons, Vic Baines here, Dr. Victoria Baines is a consultant at Interpol, UNICEF and many other bodies, former police officer, and was head of EMEA online safety for...
Oh, I wouldn't accept that responsibility.
Okay,
but yes, I was a law enforcement and intelligence service liaison at Facebook.
Oh,
yes.
Right, okay, yes. So she spent some time at Facebook and has therefore been in media calls recently about topics, and she's a leading authority and researcher in this whole area. Dr. Nika Abolokwe, OBE, has very kindly stepped in at extremely short notice because Oriel Stevens has lost her voice, and I wouldn't say that was fortunate but it is fortunate because it's wonderful to get Nika's input. She's a tech and digital governance entrepreneur, founder and CEO of Micromax Consulting, serves on a wide range of boards and committees, and was awarded an OBE in 2019, if I'm not greatly mistaken. Chris Rees is an expert on business and IT ethics. He was president of the British Computer Society in 2018 and 2019 and took the ethics of AI as his presidential theme. And I suppose the only other reason why I may have something useful to say on this other than showing the panel is that I first authored a scientific paper published in Royal Society Open Science last year called an unethical optimization principle, which actually shows mathematically why AI that tries to optimize profits disproportionately tends to find unethical strategies. It gives some kind of conceptual underpinning to what we observe, which is there are all these problems that keep popping up in slightly different ways, but they're actually at some level all manifestations of the same phenomenon, which is that humans have a bigger ability if we use our moral judgment to balance moral judgments against maximizing something, whereas nobody's figured out how to make AI do that. So these are the panel of dragons, and I'd like to invite, if I may, Ian to just give a brief description of what his business does and use that as a starting point to some of these discussions.
I would love to. First off, I just want to acknowledge everyone for being here, participating in this conversation. As AI does more and more of the intelligence work of humanity, those looking after the machines will have a much greater and greater role. So I think we're on the cutting edge of a very important conversation. I have a great interest in this because after having grown up in San Francisco and done cognitive science and decision science at Yale, I did some work for SEL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, trying to do mass persuasion efforts in the Middle East. And some of that work I did for DARPA may have come back to work for Cambridge Analytica. So the arc of my career is about using the power of mass psychology in ethical ways. So I've got a great interest in this particular topic and have been an entrepreneur in and around the UK, London tech scene for the decade following that. And the challenge that we're trying to solve is that we're in the influencer selection business, and finding the right influencers for a brand to work with for a marketing campaign is simply requires AI. It's impossible for human brains because there's 100 million influencers out there. They're decomposed by hundreds of meaningful attributes. And if you want to find the right ones, you need to figure out which attributes are predictive, how can you actually measure them in rigorous ways, how do you weight them, and then do that 100 million times. It's impossible for human brains, and that's why influencer selection is so poor today, why it's such a low return on investment marketing channel. So what we've done at Tailify is we've built an AI we built a system which combines three facets of expertise. First of all, behavioral science to teach an AI how to think like a behavioral scientist, a data science in order to embed those modules of thinking into AI, and the data engineering to make the whole thing work. So we started this journey about 1.5 years ago, hired world-class people at all the different disciplines, built a system, and we call it Fides, which is the Roman goddess of trust and good faith. We see it as also a bit of a god of judgment, and it's an influencer selection AI trained to think like a behavioral psychologist. So basically, we just take influencer performance data, like how well influencers have done on previous campaigns. We combine it with raw social media data, which we scrape from Google and Facebook's properties, namely Instagram and YouTube. We run that raw data and the training data through some basic NLP, computer vision quantitative algorithms. We derive a set of insights, machine learning features, which are basic insights like engagement, which anyone could see just by using division, but also some really interesting psychometric insights that no one else is working with. We then feed those insights into a system of machine learning classification and prediction that outputs the things you want to know as a brand, which is what kind of impressions am I going to get if I work with this influencer, what kind of conversions, therefore what kind of sales, the things that a marketer really wants to know. And so far, we've been able to predict ROI positive influencers with 71% accuracy. What's really interesting about what we do, I think, is actually the psychological component, though, because one of the things I learned from my time at SEL is the value of these psychometric scales. So one of our flagship psychometrics is values. We effectively infer what an influencer or any individual would actually answer if they took a 43 question, a psychometrically validated values instrument. This is the values compass in this case. And we infer that using language. So we've learned that brands actually have psychometric profiles as defined by values. We've learned that influencers do too, and that when influencers and brands work together, if they have aligned psychometrics, they tend to do much better. So for instance, one of our clients, Rosetta Stone, did a lot better with this influencer who shared these very similar kind of masculine agentic values, but not so well with this influencer who shared more feminine relational values because of the way that this particular brand positioned their own values. Other brands work exactly the opposite. And we see that there's a very significant correlation between return on investment that an influencer will generate and the core values congruence that the brand and this influencer will share. Now, all of this would just be trite if we could only get this out of surveys. But what we're doing is we're actually inferring these psychometrics at scale from language. So this is one of our influencers, Alana Arbucci. She said this in her video: I want to try something where I could eat whatever I want and not gain weight. So I tried intermittent fasting because I just like trying new things and looking great. Now, psychologically speaking, every word that you say says something about you. It can be labeled by a number of different psychometrics, and your words can be weighed. And we know this is true because we know for ourselves. You're learning a lot about me based on every word that I say. And if you're trained, you can infer a little bit of a psychometric profile as expressed by my words. Well, AI can do the same thing. What we do is we label keywords and phrases according to what kind of values they support. And then we use these words to create a values profile of every influencer that's online, particularly YouTubers. There are a number of other insights in development, but the whole idea is that we're inferring psychometrics from influencers' words. And it turns out it works really well. When we apply it, we get really high ROI increases, basically because we cut off the tail. There are lots of people who just are not going to perform because they don't have aligned values, among other things. And then when we exclude those from the sample, we can only focus on the authentic influencers. So if you think about this from a white hat perspective, we're facilitating authentic collaborations. If you operationalize authenticity as overlapping shared core values and other psychometric properties, that's at least how we see it. Now, in terms of the ethical issues involved, the premises that I think of when I start with this is I always start from Wilber's basic moral intuition, which is that ethics is about the greatest depth for the greatest span. You can start from different places. That's just one of the things that I think about. The other place I like to start is Marcula's 5 sources of ethical standards. So thinking about ethics from the perspective of utilitarian, rights perspective, justice, common good, and virtue, kind of the 5 main ways that we thought about ethics in the past. And I basically created, when I had my Cambridge Analytica wake-up call, a way of tackling, a way of thinking about ethical issues in a business context called the Business Ethics Canvas. I wrote a paper on it, and you basically just sit through what's the solution, who are the users, who are the other stakeholders involved, and then you reason through the implications on each of these 5 ethical foundations of Marcula. So just as a way of introing us to, I think, the landscape of the issues that I see, I want to start with, we're trying to build an influence intelligence tool to promote more authentic, high-performance relationships. So we want to make this influencer intelligence on performance and psychometrics available for anyone who might want to work with them so that they know whether they're a fit. It's a matchmaking service, effectively. And we're offering it to brands, we're offering it to marketing agencies who are also working with influencers, we're offering it to influencers themselves so that they can understand their own profile. Think of it as Experian for influencers, whereas you wouldn't make a lending decision without looking at a credit profile. You wouldn't want to make an influencer selection decision without looking at one of our profiles. Of course, other stakeholders involved are governments who might use it, the social platforms themselves who host the data, and influencers' audiences. So if we look at the issues involved, of course, we see that you can grow everyone's business, which is good for the economy, good for everyone. From a rights perspective, this is something that was brought up in an earlier conversation. There's the possibility, by the way, sorry, a green is ethical benefit in this canvas, and a red is ethical risk. So I was thinking we could use this potentially as a way to explore some of the issues involved together, and it could be, at least be a place where I could write things down. So we certainly want to protect the rights of children, particularly child influencers if they're online. Child influencers themselves is a little bit of gray area. We don't work with them in our company, but we'd want to make sure that children were excluded from this kind of work. The other thing we could do is, of course, influence could be used by governments to monitor citizenry. I'm not so worried about that because I know based on my contacts that systems like this already exist within government. So if anything, we're kind of fighting fire with fire here. From a justice perspective, this is what gets me really excited, is that I see if we get some brands spending more money to individuals, which is what, when brands spend money on influencers, they're giving money directly to the creators. Whereas when brands spend money on platforms, like paid advertising, that money goes through Google's hands first, and then influencers get a pittance back. My wife is a YouTuber. She's got 1.8 million views. Google's paid her a total of $500 in her entire career. So Google's not sharing the spoils. And actually, if money goes directly to the influencers, we could see a proper shift back to individuals from platforms. Of course, the risk with AI is always that performance predictions won't net out equitably by social groups. Our predictions of performance are not racially unbiased, but not racially biased. They will come out inequitably just by the nature of the inequitable distribution of performance across any number of intersectional groups. And then, sorry, Zoom always was that. The one common good issue is that there's a profitable creator career track will raise employment. I think it'd be great to have more creators. I think we can put 100 million creators to work with this algorithm if we create enough of a market for it. And in other words, if brands have the confidence to spend more, which they will if we can accurately predict performance. We basically made influence a viable commodity. And then finally, there's virtue, which is that there's a risk that we might suppress creativity as influencers study to the test, and that any metric can be gamed. And therefore, if this becomes a prominent thing, it be gamed just like a credit score in any number of somewhat arbitrary ways. But that's sort of inevitable when you're using any kind of an objective standard, but it is certainly a risk. So these are some of the issues that I see. And I'm hoping that with the expertise and the thoughtful intelligence of those here, that we can surface more and ideally find ways that I can make this idea, in the apocryphal word, safe and effective.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. And thank you, Rob, incidentally, who's responsible for bringing you here. And I think Rob is chairing or going to become chairman of this very, it's a privately held company.
Yes.
Moment, and hopefully not planning to be bought by Facebook or Google.
No, we've Nicholas, we've got a long way to go on this one. So we want to be the good face of marketing and advertising and influence. So that's one of the reasons why we're here today. So thanks, Ian. That was a great presentation.
So you want to be bought by WPP and not by Facebook and Google? Okay.
We might just have to become our own white hat. They're very, all of our adjacent folks are bought and paid for by a lot of people who I would rather not have this technology. And I've built technology for people I would rather not have it before.
Yeah.
So I'd like to not do that again.
I mean, I say this partly tongue in cheek, but it is actually a very real problem that you know, people build wonderful pieces of technology, but if the exit strategy is to be, the exit strategy ends up being bought by someone for whom it's a nuisance. But so, can I now pass to our dragons and get their comments, and then we'll have comments from the wider participants. And if you press your raise hand button when you want to make a comment, that would make life a little easier. Victoria, could we start with you?
Yes, absolutely. So and for the benefit of the other members of the audience, we did have a pre-chat with Ian, so some of this will sound a little bit potted. Apologies for that. I certainly work a lot on child safety and age-appropriate environments for children and young people, specifically under 18s, but then looking at the US legislation also under 13s as a risk group as well. And you mentioned about children being excluded, particularly child influencers, from being profiled. Yes. But I wonder if that also speaks to due diligence in terms of your client base, doesn't it? You've mapped out about governments being interested. Cohesive computing has a very good end as well. Sometimes we want to change people's behaviour because we want to address problematic gambling patterns or online risk situations. And so I wonder how far has your thinking gone in terms of due diligence in your client base? But then on the positive side, I noted that one of your criteria is authenticity. So we could, if this tool were used extensively, couldn't we, at the risk of being something of an idealist, we could end up in a situation where influencers are disincentivized from being inauthentic. Which means that the inauthentic influencers, and we bless her, Kim Kardashian West will push diet pills from time to time, won't she? And because she knows there's a buck in it. And if we're then incentivized to have influencers become more authentic to get more business, that could be quite a good thing, couldn't it?
Exactly. I'll pick up on the second point first because it's the easy one. The seed behind this entire company and this entire idea was this notion of creating a more authentic world. And the very reason why influencer marketing and our business is growing is that CPAs across paid channels are rising. And it's because we're seeing ad blockers, we're seeing people clicking less on paid ads. People don't trust Google and Facebook anymore, as well they shouldn't. And so trust is actually now the coin of the realm, not attention. Attention can be pulled this way or that way in artificial ways, but only trust actually gets the sale, only trust actually gets the conversion. So we're basically trying to give people a chance to monetize their influence, which is a function of the size of their audience and trust. And the problem is right now, because trust is intangible, influencers are being compensated based on the size of their audience. And so what are they doing? They're buying likes, they're buying fake followers. There's all kinds of ways you can game scale, but gaming trust, those indicators are far more subtle, because we as human beings can smell it. We know when someone's bullshitting us. And we see the patterns of how audiences react to influencers and the data, and that's actually what we're picking up on. That's what we're reading. So that we are hoping to make trust profitable, if that makes sense. Which, yeah, at the risk of being an idealist, that's exactly why I got into the business. With regards to clients' due diligence, I mean, it's really, I mean, this is one of the hardest things but it is the same problem. It's who do you trust, right? Like, you almost need to have the same kind of ethical standards that you're thinking of on a daily basis applied to every client. Now, as a startup, and so part of the reason Cambridge Analytica went the way that it did is that I know from experience, it's very difficult to, until the story broke, people didn't really appreciate the value of behavior change psychology in the world. Like, when I was at SCL, it was difficult just to get even the US Department of Defense to sign a 5-figure contract. And so when Robert Mercer came along saying, 10 million, let's expand the company, I know the executives are like, that's pretty good. And so as a startup, and we are a startup still, it's a big moral hazard to be swayed by those with money, because those with money typically don't, they typically have their own interests involved. So that's something we really need to think about in terms of where we draw the line for which clients. Obviously, based on, we don't work with anyone targeting children, of course. But if someone came along offering a lot of money who was somewhat questionable, it's a margin call. It's a gray area. I know I personally would do everything I could to keep it clean, because I think that's a really critical long-term strategy, given that we are rooted both ethically in terms of where our product is done, and also in our ethos in terms of in authenticity. Sorry, that's a long way of saying I don't know, but that's a good question.
Nico, are you ready to go next on this?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. That has been quite interesting and insightful, the background, and you've touched upon several things. My area of expertise is governance of technology, digital, and then as part of this whole thing, AI as well extends to that, and ethical governance. And you've touched on a few things here, which are interesting. As I've said, you've talked about bias. You've also talked about influencers, and you've talked about trust being the basis. Now, I have two questions. How do you control for bias, number one? And how do you define influencers? So how have you selected or come across reach the landing point on your influencers?
So I'll take the easy question first again. Influencers are those who have at least 10,000 followers. And there are many definitions. For some, it's 10,000, for some it's 25,000, but we're merely defining it in terms of a minimum audience size on any of these social platforms that we actually connect to. In terms of how we control for bias, it's this is a really sticking point, because it depends on if we build an algorithm that is geared. So performance is necessary to unlock the kind of future that we're trying to build here, a world that is based on authenticity. And in theory, authenticity should be colorblind. If authenticity is not colorblind or not gender blind, for instance, which it won't be inevitably, we already know that women over-index on certain psychometrics compared to men, and I'm not familiar with the research on ethnicity, but I'm sure that that's the case among many psychometric properties as well. Do we correct for that? Do we value race or gender or any of these demographic factors over authenticity? Would that be compromising the core thing? And we haven't yet come to that decision point yet, but I honestly don't know how I'd answer that question. I mean, it almost comes down to a certain extent your politics. For me, I would, to be perfectly honest, I would pretty much just focus on authenticity. And if it doesn't net out in an equitable way, I would, rather than tilting the playing field to make certain people seem more authentic than they actually are, and then brands not even engaging with them, diminishing the meaning of authenticity, the meaning of performance, I would probably choose to favor performance. If anything, I wouldn't make the adjustments in the bottleneck itself or in the measurement itself. I would rather make the adjustments in the services. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to build a kind of an influencer CV tool. So just like you can see your credit profile on Experian today, we want to allow all influencers to see their performance profile, to see how it is that Fides, our AI, sees them. And then we offer services to basically help bump their score up. So there are certain persuasive patterns we pull out from language, certain ways of speaking, which we know work to improve conversion. Most influencers are not good salespeople. They're on a journey of creativity, from being kind of awkward in front of the camera to being these kind of masterful, persuasive people that they are. Everyone's at a different point, and I'd like to get everyone up that curve rather than changing the way that the curve is evaluated in itself. So it's not really, I just don't see the answer in the AI. I see the answer more in the ecosystem of services that go around the score, that go around the AI.
Nico,
That's my
if
shoot
you
from the hip example.
to that, or you
Sorry?
have, is that good, or do you want to?
Yeah.
No, we can come back to that. I don't want to hug the limelight. We can come back to that in terms further down. I've noted a few points that I'd like to raise, but we can come back to that later.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Chris,
Thank you for that, Ian. Yeah.
Chris, would you like to, as the next dragon?
Thank you, Nicholas. And indeed, thank you for Ian, for the presentation. Fascinating. You've put a lot of emphasis on trust. Damon O'Neill has spoken and written a lot about that, including to the company. And her point, one of her fundamental issues is it's not about trust, it's about trustworthiness.
Yes.
And we need to know and decide whom to trust and whom not to trust.
Yes.
And I wonder if your system helps in that domain. Since it seems to be the way this afternoon, I'll throw in another question. Your last point about gaming the system. And it struck me that you would be encouraging influencers to play to the investor or the brand. And that might work, but it might work against authenticity.
So,
Would you like to comment?
no, I'm just going to move on to the next one, please. No, kidding. Yes. That talk by that professor whose name I just remember seeing her TED talk like a decade ago and thinking,
Yes.
yeah, that's a really good distinction. Because that distinction isn't popularly talked about, I usually just use the word trust, but we are ultimately trying to monetize trustworthiness. Trust is a function of relationship. We of course want more trust where it's merited, and so we're trying to highlight influencers that are trustworthy, or in other words, trusted, which is the past tense verb form of trust, which would correlate quite strongly with trustworthiness. So it is really about trustworthiness and monetizing people's trustworthiness. In terms of gaming the system, it's the factors that we look at for me make it. I'm not quite so worried about this. So actually, should I bring this up? No, okay, that's a bit secret sauce and it'll take too long to go through. But some of the factors are a function of the relationship with their audience. So, for instance, one of the things that we found is that how often an influencer responds personally to comments on their videos has a strong correlation with conversion, because they're effectively building that relationship. So if we were to tell influencers that, which I think we would, we have no reason not to, what kind of impact would that have? Would that make the influencer more authentic or less authentic? If they are responding in an authentic way to those comments, like just saying, hey, or like, question mark or smiley face, then perhaps that could make it worse. And yet, I know, as someone who approves all of my wife's comments and all of her YouTube videos, that yeah, when she responds, people respond back and they say, thank you, it's so good to really hear from you, even if it's a really simple response. Like that factor, along with most of the factors, if influencers knew about them and they were to actually follow them, I think they actually would become better influencers than worse influencers. In the same way that when Experian tells me, I should really get some lower interest credit cards and to consolidate my debt in order to improve my credit rating, I'm like, that's probably a good idea. I should be doing that. So it comes down to the nature of the predictors of performance and the nature of authenticity is that it is difficult to game, at least the way that we've measured it. Though, of course, we'll need to monitor that closely. I'm not super duper worried about that yet, but it's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. These are all incredibly helpful and valuable. Thank you, guys.
So I note that we've got two hands up. I will do my sort of dragon bit and then take the comments from people with hands up, and you're encouraged to use the famous hands up facility on Zoom to do it. So yes, plus that we have two more physical people in the room.
We can't see.
One of whom, Ian Mitchell, has flown down, especially from Glasgow, Edinburgh, for this. So we will definitely take their comments. 3 points come to me. I mean, first of all, given my particular background, the question is always, what do you optimize? What precisely are you optimizing? Because if you know what you're trying to optimize, it gives a better idea of the kinds of unethical behavior that might happen as a side effect. But it is nevertheless just a horrible truth that if you try and optimize, if an AI tries to optimize anything, there is a disproportionate risk of them selecting unethical strategies. That doesn't say there's 100% chance of it. It's just that it makes the unethical strategies more likely to come to the top. The second thing which really strikes me is this seems to have a very individual focus. But what about teams and diversity? And I think there are two aspects to this. First of all, you say you're teaching your AI to think like a behavioral psychologist. And you will know better than I do that behavioral psychologists have recently been heavily criticized because almost all their studies are done on weird people. One is an educated industrialist, I forget what, rich, and I forget what even the democratic. That's right. And it turns out, amazingly, that when these papers were done, oh, by the way, most of these studies historically were done paying no attention to the gender of the participants. And it turns out that when you try and replicate these studies on a more diverse audience, some of them work and some of them very badly don't. Now, this is not the only social, I mean, many other sciences, including cancer research, it turns out to be very difficult to replicate even very highly cited papers. But I think there is a danger that we assume that certain things are universal truths because they've been proven by scientific studies, when it turns out that the people that they've done this on are a very, very small subset of humanity. And so the other side, so you could, for example, have a set of behaviors that came across as extremely authentic to weird people, but would come across as extremely inauthentic to other groups who are bizarrely called minorities, despite the fact that weird people are actually a very tiny minority of the human race. But then the second aspect of this, if I may, is that just picking a bunch of influencers, each of whom is extremely effective at communicating, might not be the optimum strategy if you want to reach an audience, because they might all be communicating very effectively with the same audience and completely failing to engage with other segments of the population who collectively you might want to get to. This is partly the long tail approach, and it's partly all these approaches about sort of who is in your sample size compared to who your target audience. And then the third point, which you've kind of touched on, is almost every algorithm, especially with deep learning, if you start having adversarial optimization, you can make it do completely bonkers things. There's some progress being made on the research on this, but it seems to me that you're faced with a very nasty trade-off, because if you're transparent about what the algorithms are that you're using, you open yourself to adversarial optimization. But if you're not transparent, then there's an issue of where your trustworthiness comes from.
Could you explain what you mean by adversarial optimization? I don't think I've heard that term before.
Okay, so the famous example is in machine vision. And there's a completely beautiful, so you find that when you train things using deep neural networks for machine vision, they can be very impressive on your training set and things closely related. But then if somebody deliberately games your algorithm by injecting minute, very small amounts of noise in a clever way, they can completely confuse your algorithm into making misqualifications. So there's a beautiful example of a pig, which is clearly a pig, and then you have exactly this picture which looks identical to the human eye, but the system thinks it's an aeroplane. And there's a whole, this is a hot research field, but you need to know about it. It turns out that any deep learning network, unless it's been specifically made proof to adversarial optimization, is enormously susceptible to this. And by the way, I mean, that's just a toy thing, but you turn a non-malignant tumor into a malignant tumor, and you get, $50,000 of reimbursement from the insurer instead of $2,000. Then, wow, you've cured a malignant carcinoma, you get an enormous sum of money. You haven't done anything at all. You've just, accidentally injected a little bit of noise into the picture, and nobody can even see that you've done this thing. So you need to find out about this, and I don't know the details of how it applies to your thing, but I think it's basically now a theorem that any deep learning network can be hit by adversarial optimization.
It's certainly data poisoning is something that's been highlighted as a key trend for cybercrime in the near to mid future.
Wow, that's a fun one. Definitely learned something new with that today. I will certainly look into that and how we can defend ourselves. I mean, luckily we're not big enough for that to be relevant, but when we are, speaking reality into existence, that will definitely be something we'll need to look at. So taking those again in order of ease and understanding. Teams versus individuals, interaction effects. You're absolutely right that it's not just about an individual influencer. Ultimately, when advertisers look and delivers the best campaign, and their interaction effects. The way that we were able to predict the Arab Spring riots in Jordan in my DARPA project almost a decade ago is we were looking at to what extent the same memes or stories were passed between different clusters in the social network. And we found that the more that the same individual node was exposed to a particular story from different disparate sources drawn from different communities, the more likely that node was to pass on the story. Because if your dad tells you to go see the new Superman movie, and then like your colleague who doesn't know your dad tells you to go to see the new Superman movie, it's more persuasive than if your mom and your dad go see the new Superman movie, because those two people don't know each other. So there are absolutely these network effects that we would need to model, audience overlap being one of the key ones. We simply don't have the data yet to do that. So that there's enormous sensitivity in the value of an influencer, enormous sensitivity. And the combinations, the interaction effects among influencers are absolutely one of them. And as we get the data, we hope to model that, because that's something, if you do have the data, it is modelable and extremely powerful and extremely interesting. On the academic, in terms of diverse samples and the way in which authenticity might mean something different to others, it's really something we have to consider in the literature on a psychometric by psychometric basis. So the values model we have is built off of Shalom Schwartz's work, who's been working on this idea since the 80s. And there's a pretty large literature validating the cross-cultural, effectively that the values circumflex that we're modeling off for every individual influencer and brand is culturally universal. It just seems to be wired into our DNA. Now, how we infer those values, is someone who values achievements going to talk about it differently depending upon their life experience, their background? Probably so, and that's why expanding the dictionaries is really important. Now, the nice thing about inferring things from language, as opposed to inferring things from, say, images, which are suspects to all kinds of cultural biases, because the world manifests in very different ways in the world, is that the word tends to be pretty stable. We use the word achievement. That word means something across everyone in this culture, everyone who speaks English, because it wouldn't, there's no such thing as a private language, Wittgenstein said. Like, you're not gonna, it wouldn't be a word if there wasn't some sense of a shared meaning. So inferring psychometrics from language, as long as people are speaking the same language, seems like a relatively safe thing, as long as the underlying psychometrics that we're estimating or working with are actually real human universals and not quite specific psychometrics pulled out of WASPy students who happen to live near a psychology department building. Values, personality, big five is as well studied as anything. Emotions, again, Ekman 6, there's a ton of research around the universality of human emotions, at least the basic ones. Most of the things we're looking at, I think, are pretty well researched, pretty well grounded in the cross-cultural literature. And yet there'll be some that will absolutely be biased. And I think your last point was on the disproportionate risks of selecting unethical strategies. That seems to me related to the game one. I mean, actually, I'd love to hear. I mean, what risk of unethical strategies do you see, Nicholas, this kind of algorithm might select?
If I knew what you were optimizing, I'd know. I'd be able to have a better.
Well, the algorithm is trained against conversion rate. So conversion rate is a thing which no one knows. It's not online. You only know it if you work with the brands and you have the brand's data. But it's our measure of commercially relevant behavior change. And so that's what our performance prediction algorithm is trained on. We've got another set of algorithms which just pull out the raw psychometrics, which are, there isn't really an outcome variable there. It's just
the obvious immediate risk, but I don't want to hog this conversation, is you're getting lots of conversions from people who, for one reason or another, shouldn't be buying the product. They're selling an awful lot of wonderful Mars bars to people who are perhaps obese. You're selling, high performance cars to people who don't know how to drive. You see what I mean? But I'm anxious to bring in other people. The moment there's always some unethical thing that you might be optimizing, and once you ask that question, it kind of helps. Ben Collier has been very patiently holding his hand up for a while.
Thank you very much. Just right at the end of your conversation there, you touched on what I was going to ask. So I was going to say, well, clearly this is going to be optimizing for conversions, right?
Right.
And I just wondered, my question really was, where do you stop optimizing? Because it seems to me what you set up here, it's clearly a feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
So your companies are going to come up with, they're going to be optimizing for sales using the metrics, and your metrics are going to get more and more detailed over time until you've got this kind of massive multivariate model that that can kind of characterize somebody to within an inch of their life. Then you've got on the other side, you've got the influencer who will probably end up using AI to customize what they're doing, what they're saying, and they'll be producing new versions of themselves. You know, I'll change my ear to make it lower so that somebody watching it finds themselves more attracted to me. And then I'll have a different one where my glasses are missing. And what will happen is this thing just generates and generates and generates. And we talked about optimization, but what you've described is the definition of a generative adversarial learning algorithm, right? And what they're currently used for is generating images that humans cannot tell from real life. So my question would be, does this get to a point where I have a kind of pantheon of influencers who I'm completely unable to stop watching and who I'm unable to stop myself from buying from?
Talk about Rich. This is one of the things I love about these ethical discussions. The presumption of success. It's all rich people's problems in a certain manner of speaking. When we get to that point, that will be a very relevant conversation to have. When do we stop optimizing? Though I'll say there's an interesting element about the nature of authenticity, and it relates to what Chris was saying about trust. It's that trust is a function of relationship. And authenticity is also a function of relationship. I can have an authentic relationship with one brand, but a totally transactional relationship with another brand because I just don't care about it. And you can smell the difference as an audience member. And most of we've seen in the data that the biggest factors that influence whether a collaboration that'll be successful are not what I would call intrinsics, like just the nature of how persuasive an influencer is and how engaged their audience is. That plays a big role. But the biggest impact is actually what I call relevance, which is effectively the fit between an influencer and a brand. So what makes one influencer valuable is going to be different from brand to brand. And so influencers actually don't, when it comes to the relevance factors, the most productive factors, they actually don't have an incentive. They have an incentive to be themselves. They have an incentive to be true to their own values because presumably there are enough brands who are like them, but by which they could actually build a business off of. And that it's almost, I think Naval Ravikant has said many times, you escape competition through authenticity. The person trying to be the next Kim Kardashian and going after the same brands Kim Kardashian is going on is usually, and just what we've seen from the influencers we follow, not going to do as well as the influencer who tries to lean into things that make them most unique, and therefore they then occupy the white space of brands seeking them because they become more unique, they become more valuable. Value follows uniqueness. So I like to believe that this would incentivize authenticity in true sense of the world, not just as a function of relationship, but as a function of being yourself. Because it turns out in this game of influence, being yourself is quite a profitable strategy.
Good. Damien Heal has his hand raised as well.
Yes, thank you. I was just interested in the way in which you correlate with influencer and language versus reciprocity, because my understanding is that one of the bigger determinants of people's ability to be influenced by people is the degree of reciprocity of behavior. Yeah. So, and that is a very personal reaction, which goes beyond just pure language. And you mentioned it briefly that when people respond, which is more physical, but in the world of cyberspace and the world of technology, the level and depth of reciprocity is remarkably less compared to the physical interactions you get or the interactions between other people and individuals in a real world. So, I mean, the degree to which the influencer version on the internet versus physical or other actions that are reciprocal are influential. I was wondering about how that is correlated through your models and taken into account.
It's a great question. There's so many flavors of reciprocity in this space, but of course, I focus on language because it's the most psychometrically rich place to look. I learned that a while ago through my cousins at Cambridge Analytica, who inferred personality from the comments that people would make on Facebook. But the behavior that people do online, the subtle behaviors, is also big. So the two examples that I have of how reciprocity impacts performance that I've seen is that one, when influencers respond to comments, which is a kind of a reciprocity, there's a time investment of making comment, a time investment of receiving it. That influencer's audience is more likely to buy. We know that from the data. But there's also reciprocity. This is what's so interesting about influence. Influence always happens in the context of community. There's reciprocity within influencer communities. It turns out, we found that if you were to take the comment section of the last 50 videos an influencer has done, and you were to map out the comment section like a social graph, whereby any individual that commented on any other individual, that's like a vertex and a link, and you map out that social graph, the density of that social graph, the number of inter-commenting behaviors that people do, which I can see as a form of a reciprocity, also predicts conversion. In other words, people sell each other through the comments. People build relationships through the comments, through the give and take of conversation, through those reciprocal interactions. So I see those things as effectively proxies to the kind of reciprocity that I think that you're getting at. We can only see so much online, but there's that which we can see. There's quite a bit of signal in it.
Do you engage directly with the influencers, or is your engagement only directly with the advertisers and the companies?
Both. We're the intelligence source that sits in the middle of influencers and advertisers. So we contract directly with influencers and with brands.
Okay. And do you analyze influencers who are not influencers with whom you've contracted?
Yes, we work with any influencer that's online. We scrape all of social media in order to create our pool.
You see, the question, because I've spent 2 weeks litigating about it, just last week. Have you sort of done a GDPR audit in respect of the material you're gathering from influencers with whom you're not contracting? The reason, I'll mention it, is you would have a legitimate business interest to gather the material from the websites, either directly or through an aggregator. And although legitimate interest has to be balanced against fundamental rights, because they've made all this public, they've got no expectation of their fundamental rights being affected. So, gathering the information is fine, but there is the Article 14 obligation, which is information gathered from somebody who is not the data subject, informing them of their data rights. Most people get out of that because it's it's insofar as practicable. But given that you would be analysing specific data subjects, i.e. the influencers with whom you haven't contracted, it might be difficult to say it's not practicable to send them an Article 14 notice. Have you thought through that?
Gosh, I've been putting that off because I know that it's like everyone does GDPR. I know that the kind of scraping that we're doing is extremely common in the industry. And in fact, I don't know of a single person in our position in the industry that does not either scrape data themselves or rely upon scrape data. So it's one of those unacknowledged and yet universal gray areas in this space. As you said, influencers, and this is, I think, the distinction between what we did, what we're doing, what Cambridge Analytica did. Cambridge Analytica had to use a dev loophole to get lots of quite personal data on the broad population of US and UK voters on Facebook. And we're not going after audiences. We're merely trying to understand influencers who I think are ostensibly public figures. They're out there. And also they're quite verbose, and therefore we can learn a lot from them.
I don't think there's a problem with scraping the data for the reasons you explained, but there's a little tick box question about whether you tell them once you've done it.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and there's a marketing opportunity notifying them. So thank you for helping me kill two birds with one stone.
I mean, I spoke about a few things in terms of the biases, and you talked about your selection process and the results and optimization and all. Now, just in terms of the influencers, I go back again to the influencers, and it's looking at the influencers in the round, and the influencers usually reinventing themselves to either retain their audience, increase their popularity. How do you track for that, given that this is an unregulated space? And when we just had somebody mention GDPR, but this space is largely unregulated, and also regulation tracks innovation. So when you're talking about influencers and influencers that reinventing themselves, I mean, social media is very, very dynamic and very fast-paced, given its nature. It's a public platform for people to come in there and collaborate. How do you then track and manage in terms of the authenticity of your influencers, and also consequently the matching? This is the sort of matchmaking process. The last thing I was going to go on to was yourself or your teams and how you build these algorithms. Are you building them in your own likeness? Do you have a diverse team behind you? How is that process informed? And consequently the results as well. Yeah.
That's a great question. On influencers reinventing themselves, and having my wife now giving birth to our second in a few months, she's completely reinvented herself. And it's a challenge because you're so often measured by that legacy. And so one of the things one of the decisions we have to make is what is the denominator? So we look at engagements or psychometrics as exemplified over the last X posts. If we go back 50 posts, we get a much richer data set. However, is an influencer the same 50 posts ago as they are now? No, not necessarily. So one of the fun things we get to do is as we track this, because we rescrape every month to keep these influencers fresh, we can actually see the way that they change and move, and the way their personality as expressed in their videos and their values as expressed in their videos may or may not evolve. So that's going to be a really interesting decision to make when we get there. That's a really good point.
So I want to ask the three other dragons just to make concluding remarks, and I'm afraid I don't think there'll be time for you to respond to them. And then Deputy Master can have the final word.
Well, I'd only conclude by saying that this has been an incredibly rich conversation, uncovering a whole variety of new issues for me, and I suspect that Ian has also picked up a couple of points.
Definitely.
And I think we should be very grateful for Ian for putting his head in the noose.
So Ian, I'm absolutely not expecting you to answer this question. And it's just something that exercises me at the moment, because I've been looking at how our appetite for authenticity might be undergoing change at the moment. In our pre-conversation, we talked about Lil Michaela, who, for those of you who don't know, she's an entirely synthetic influencer. She doesn't exist outside of data, but she's a model who models for Prada and various other folks online. We've all got used to chatbots, haven't we? And we don't have an expectation that that is a real person. And we sometimes quite often divulge quite sensitive information, and including personal data to them. And if Mark Zuckerberg has his way, we will all be immersed in an entirely computer-generated metaverse fairly soon. So I wonder if it's worth thinking about the extent to which that appetite for authenticity might actually be undergoing something of a shift in the years to come.
That's an interesting one. This is what I was talking about, the pig. You insert some non-random noise, so you get the second picture. But the machine classifies it as an airliner. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for participating in this. It raises some really interesting issues. We clearly have an issue around time, because this could go on for a long time. But if we have a discussion board, that might help. The last word to our Deputy Master.
Thank you, everybody, and Ian in particular. In fact, as has been said, as Chris said, putting your head in the noose, that was a very brave thing to do. And I hope we'll find other people willing to do it. So I think it's a really fascinating conversation. And I hope you found it useful yourself, Ian, and also Rob, as the director of the company. I think this is a great initiative, and I hope we continue it. So my last question to you, which is very cheeky, is, how do we trust you?
Oh, gosh.
Responses on the postcard.
Well, hopefully I've created enough of a corpus of speech that you've weighed my words. and then you can come to your own conclusion based on your own internal algorithms here. But ultimately, it's a functional relationship. Some of you have a track record. So we've got some interesting data. We'll be publishing some papers around this, credibility indicators and brands, like everyone else, for first impressions. But you've met me personally, so you can decide whether I'm trustworthy or not.
I'm going to employ Nick Clegg to be your chairman of your advisory board. That would definitely get everybody, would definitely cause people to come to judgments about your trustworthiness, shall we say. Thank you all to everybody, especially our distinguished dragons.